Time, weather, and highways.
This is King Carouse, and you're listening to the Black History Buff podcast, a podcast about all things black and historical. Today's episode is a little different. Rather than my usual saunter through a specific point in time, today I'm doing an interview. Now, I don't normally do interviews for lots of reasons. They're difficult to organise, time zones are a nightmare, and if I'm honest, they remind me a lot of work. But my reluctance to do interviews were all put aside when I received an intriguing email. Dear Sir / Madam, I am the co-author of A Cry to War. My co-author and I would love to be invited to give an interview on your platform about African history, culture, and what inspired us to write this book. Book, you say? We are both of African descent, but raised in the UK. I'm Nigerian and she is Ghanaian. Some background about it. Title, A Cry to War. It is an African book set in the 13th century West Africa before slavery. Like me, many Africans wonder what Africa looked like before any contact with the West. This book brings the lives of our ancestors back to life and retells a historical truth in a fictional world. It dramatises the conflicts, politics, triumphs, and a number of West African kingdoms such as the Benin Kingdom, the Ghanaian Empire, the Malian Kingdom, and the Fulani people. The story stretches across countries, seas, and continents, showing the great variation in language, customs, and traditions between tribes, but also the unity displayed by different characters to overcome adversity. Please see the attached press release and cover. Kind regards, Enosadeda Odiase. What? African? History? Tribes? Benin Kingdom? Ghanaian Empire? I had to find out more. So, after some toing and froing and a little bit of organisation and a bit of calendar coordination, I finally pinned Nosa down and we sat down and had a conversation via Skype. Now, because this is an internet recording, the audio is not up to my usual standards. Yeah, there, I said it. I admit it. You know how precious I am about my sound. But we had a great chat, and I implore you to check it out. In the background, you'll hear the usual police sirens and chair scrapings that you get, especially the police sirens that you get in any urban environment. And yeah, you know what, guys, I live in the hood, so it kind of just is what it is. All right, so kick back, relax, and enjoy the interview. We kick off with me asking Nosa to introduce himself and to tell us a little bit about his background.
I'm Enosadeda Odiase. I'm Nigerian by origin. Both my parents are Nigerian. And basically, by profession, I'm a mechanical engineer. Currently, I reside in London. And, you know, as I'm sure a lot of us in the diaspora were fascinated by African history and understanding sort of our roots and so on and so forth. And that, from when I was, you know, a lot younger in my teenage years, I've always sort of gone to museums and try to understand my history, predominantly the Benin history, because that's where my dad is from. And he's over the years, always made sure that I was connected to it. And he's told me stories about ancient kings and ancient obas, we call them in the Benin Kingdom. And, you know, and over the last few years, before I wrote the book, or before we wrote the book, I was sort of, you know, exposed to a lot of European literature. So you had obviously The World of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, which gave us Game of Thrones. You know, we had Lord of the Rings, which I was a massive fan of when I was a lot younger. Currently, we have Vikings, which is also a huge TV show. And there's lots of books, obviously, I would say, delving into sort of European history and European mythology. But as much as I like those books and I like those sort of TV shows, I don't feel like it does represent me as a person. And looking at my own history, there is that amount of sort of content in there, and amount of sort of history dating back hundreds and thousands of years. But I feel like there's not enough said about it. There's not enough books written about it, both fictional and non-fictional. And that obviously motivated us to say, actually, there's no point of saying, oh, actually, there's not enough Black African people writing. We can actually take it on ourselves and actually affect the change.
So, you know, I love fantasy fiction as well. Like I grew up, like one of the first books I read as a child, it's a quite funny story. So I'm an undiagnosed dyslexic. So at school I had difficulty reading, right? And they would always put me in the bottom groups for everything. So I was very frustrated not because of the group per se, but the other kids who were in the group for reading and writing that I was in. Let's just say it was a challenging group. Okay, so we're going back a few years before they really got into SEN and how to deal with autism and Asperger's and so forth. But I would say, looking back on it now, those were the type of children I was in the room with. And as a young kid, probably like 6 or 7, I remember looking around the room and my little brain going, I don't match what's going on in this room. I need to get out.
Right.
So I asked one of the teachers and they said, well, when your reading improves, we'll take you out. So I remember I went to the school library that day and the first book I picked out was The Hobbit. I just literally went in to find the biggest book I could find. Remember, I'm like 6 or 7. So I pick out The Hobbit and I memorized the whole of the first chapter. I sat down and I was like, right, I'm memorizing this because the words would dance when I read it live. So I memorized it that night. And so the next day I went in to school and I fake read the book from but I'm actually reading from memory, and then closed it and said, can you take me out of the class? And they shifted me out. And so that kind of spawned, one, it made me realize from a very young age I was going to have to work really hard at this whole reading thing. And the second thing is it spawned a love of fantasy fiction, because I fell in love with that book and I became a massive Tolkien fan and I understood all of that. So the whole fantasy worlds, and I read, you know, Lord of the Rings and Wizard of Earthsea and all of those books and Game of Thrones and all of them. So like when I came across, when I got your email and I saw what you'd done, I was like, this is right up my street. Like someone has grabbed hold of the narrative and taken control of it and decided that they're going to do African fantasy. And I couldn't think of anything better. I'm like, how much history and heritage is there to mine and explore? Like, why is this not a thing? There's so much there. We're looking at goblins and wizards and made up lands when we actually have this rich pool of history to draw from. And it's in a weird way, in an almost odd parallel. It's another resource, but it's one that hasn't been tapped. And this one, you actually have like a clear run at it, a credible and clear run at it. So I think what you're doing is amazing, and I think the reasons behind why you're doing it is amazing as well. But a question I want to ask you is, so you're an engineer student by trade?
I study engineering at King's College.
So King's College, very prestigious university in the UK, renowned for producing doctors and people in the medical profession. So I'm thinking, you know, you're a young man, you're surrounded by doctors, medical students, you're studying engineering. How did you make the leap from looking at, you know, engineering, hard science, numbers, facts, to right, I'm going to write a fantasy African historical novel? How does that happen? At what point, you know, did you walk into a session and you were like, forget this, I need to do this? How does that, talk me through that process?
I mean, no, it's funny you asked that, because someone else asked, another radio interview, the Nigerian guy asked me exactly the same question. I think, like, we all have sort of our hobbies, don't we? Like, even though, like, you might be you might find a banker who's interested in painting, for instance, and it's the same way you'd find an engineer who's interested in writing.
Yep.
I mean, before that, I'd never written anything before, and it was kind of my motivation for doing it, as I explained before, was because I wanted to tell an African story, and that made me think, okay, as an engineer, the way you go about solving a problem is first you try to understand the problem, then you figure out a methodology of actually going about solving that problem, and then at the end of it, you find a solution. So me trying to write the story is me basically following the same process. So it was literally, right, I haven't written anything before. I've read quite a few books. What are the processes of writing a fictional book? So it was like you needed to carry out a lot of research about that period in time, the customs of the people, the sort of terrain and the landscape in West Africa.
So at this point in the interview, mentally, I couldn't help but be absolutely fascinated listening to Nosa, an engineer, break down what is usually seen as a creative process in such a logical and procedural way. And it really made me think about the way I conduct research for this podcast, and made me realise that I follow a very similar path of identifying problems, completing research, and testing theories until I find what feels like the right solution. Nosa's a very smart guy, and I think that way of thinking is useful to all of us in any of our endeavours. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. Back to Nosa.
Understanding the mythology around it, and then after I've done the research element of it, the next part was to try and understand how you write a story. So the story arcs, the world building, the character development, and all of these sort of tools that basically kind of ties the entire story together. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, as it is a fictional book set in West Africa, as you know, West Africa obviously is a part of the world which is, it has various cultures and traditions. Even though we're all Africans, we speak different languages. We sort of have different cultures and different traditions, even serve different gods, traditional gods even. So in that instance, I needed to find a way in order to represent various aspects, major West African tribes, major West African cultures, and major West African sort of mythology and tradition, and represent them in a certain form in that book. But the entire process of writing the story, it may sound a bit crazy, but it's similar to solving an engineering problem, because the problem is creating an African fantasy, and the sort of steps of solving that is the same way you solve an engineering problem. Okay.
So in terms of researching the culture and the history, I mean, obviously you've got your own background and knowledge to draw upon. Talk me through some of the research that you did, and in doing your research, did you have any kind of like whoa moments where you thought I did not, or anything you found that kind of like blew your mind?
Well, I would say the vast majority of the time I was sort of like it was a learning process more for me as well as a writer, because a lot of the stories my dad told me was based on the Benin Kingdom, which is just one sort of representation in the story.
Hi, it's me again. And I just wanted to interject to say, if you're a studious person who likes to take notes and follow up on things, and you've ever wondered where a good place might be to start researching into African history, get your notebook out now, as Nosa lists a number of kingdoms that are a great starting point for anybody wanting to learn more.
But you also have sort of the Songhai Kingdom, which is what is currently Ghana. You've got the Malin Kingdom, which is represented. You've got the Fulani people, the Yoruba people, and some major tribes that are represented there. So in order for me, whilst carrying out the research, I was able to learn a lot about these people and learn a lot about their history. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of sort of civilizations, ancient civilizations that I wasn't actually aware of. I mean, obviously when you talk about African history and sort of ancient Africa, you think of Egypt. That's they tend to be the main sort of focus.
Yeah.
But when you actually research other areas, you realize that actually there's more there than you've been led to believe.
Right.
So it was definitely interesting. And the interesting part of it was not just in this book, but in the next book, I'm able to pull out some of those sort of, I would say, not just the history, but the influence of various aspects in Africa into the book and sort of, like, I would be able to explore the influence of Islam, or how Islam came into Africa, and sort of the impact it had on sort of the traditional religions in the area, good and bad, and also looking at various cultures that existed before that. So like the sort of trans-Saharan trade, which also included various things like gold as well as slaves, which I think is not as talked about as the transatlantic slave trade. So that's another aspect of the story which I found quite eye-opening and quite interesting, because that was not something I had read a lot about. So during this research, I was able to actually learn a lot about that. I think the important thing from a black African and a black person's point of view is the idea of, sort of we having fully functional working civilizations. Because the one thing that is thrown at us quite a lot is the fact that we find it difficult as Africans to have really sort of functional, strong governments that actually work for the people and are not corrupt, and and researching and writing this sort of fictional books shows that we had civilizations dating back, hundreds, thousands of years that were actually ahead of their time and quite advanced. And that was quite, I knew about these, but actually researching it more and understanding that there was actually more civilizations in different parts of West Africa, even different parts of Africa, is quite important, I think, because, it shows that we had, we had great civilizations, great empires that rose and fell.
Most definitely. I think there is a massive misconception between being technologically advanced and being civil. And the biggest misconception is that the continent of Africa wasn't civil and wasn't technologically advanced, when the truth is, and probably as you've demonstrated in the book and as you're saying now, is that they were both evident. So to stay on the book, because I could talk to you about you and your journey all day, right? So for the listeners, give me a summary of what the book's about. Draw us into your world. Paint the picture.
Right. So like, A Cry to War is, so the way I formed the story was based on an ancient king who actually did exist. It was called Oba Ewari the First. So it was an ancient Benin ruler. He had a quite interesting sort of rise to power, and he kind of got driven away, and then he came back and he fought his brother in order to get back in power at the time. So the main character here is called King Ewari, which is kind of a draw of him, but not, the story doesn't explicitly follow his sort of real life route, basically, or story. So A Cry to War is formed of mainly 5 African kingdoms, and those 5 kingdoms represent different parts of sort of mainly West African. So you go like Mombaka, which is predominantly sort of the Benin and the Yoruba kingdom kind of put together. So you go Songhai, which is the ancient Songhai kingdom, which is sort of modern day Ghana, which is represented in that area. You've got the Kinjaja Kingdom, which is similar to what the Malian Kingdom. And then you've got Ameria, which is similar to it has the Fulani tribe in there. And then you got Bakuman Kingdom, which is more sort of, I would say, Northern African, sort of like Moroccan, Tunisian sort of cultures in that area, and sort of the Mediterranean sort of cultures there. Now, in this book, you've got different, I don't want to spoil it too much, but you've got different mythologies. So they're all African mythologies. So you have like God of the sea, God of the sky, and, that are represented in the traditional Olokun, Ogun, like the actual African names, and they follow the same mythology effectively. So in the story, which is centered around King Elwari, he's a traditional African sort of West African ruler. Mm-hmm. He's got 2 wives. He's got 2 wives, 5 kids, and he's at a crossroad basically. So he's had peace for a certain amount of years. He had peace for 20 years after there's been a war for a while where his dad died in battle fighting a foreign ruler, and basically at this point his wife wants him to get a revenge on the death of his father for her own sort of personal reasons. And he himself has an internal conflict in terms of he knows or he feels that his dad would be proud of him if he was able to get revenge for his death. So he's kind of contemplating whether or not to maintain peace for the long run, because they've obviously had it for quite a significant amount of time, or to actually go back to war. So he deals with that internal conflict for a while, and then he definitely then decides on that issue and takes a path which basically sets the story apart.
So sometimes when you're doing interviews about books, it's really easy to kind of talk around the book and you miss the essence of what the book is actually about. So I've taken it on myself to read a short extract from the beginning of the book. A Cry to War, Chapter 1, A Lion Asleep. The year of the lion, 1267 AD. King Oware threaded silently through the thick grass so not to alert a stranded antelope of his presence. With the animal in his sight, he aimed his wooden spear with sharpened bronze teeth and waited patiently for the right moment to strike. The king's breath drew warm, vision blurred with thousands of insects buzzing in front. His hand shook to his beating heart, but his gaze stood still, eager to not go home without a kill. Then came a gust of wind, blowing briskly across the field, washing away the swarm of insects and the antelope from his sight. Wondering where it went, Oware scanned the distant trees, his worn hands flooded with sweat, with more dripping down his chiseled face as the evening heat boiled. He knew if he flinched a muscle, the antelope would smell its almost certain death. So he continued searching, with eyes wide open, darting from tree to tree. The animal must have sensed danger and purposely hid away. With the sound of a snapped branch, Oware regained his target. He inched closer to his prey, which was seemingly unaware of the impending hunter. Lost and alone, the creature must have separated from its herd and their protection. In an unexpected moment, the two had a second of eye contact. They stood still and unsure of the future. In a split second, the antelope sprinted away, but Oware remained still. The king aimed for the animal's heart and released his spear, sending it sailing through the tranquil Agbon forest. It followed a narrow but defined path cutting between tall, aged trees and thin branches before piercing the antelope's belly, crushing its ribs and narrowly missing its heart. The antelope fell to the wet forest floor with blood spurting into the warm air. Oware rushed to meet his kill and sliced the animal's neck open with a merciful swish of his sword, relieving it of pain and of life itself. The king placed the animal on his bare back and marched home, pensive. So he's got a father to avenge. He's got a wife or wives with conflicting opinions, and he's caught in the horns of a dilemma. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, it's easy to say he's the main. It's easy to look at the cover and look at the synopsis and think of him as the main character of the book, which, to a certain extent, he is. But the story doesn't center just around him. So obviously, like I mentioned, he has a second wife who had our motivations. So we kind of develop that part of the story of why she wanted him to do that, what gain she would get if he does go to war, and her motivations, where she came from. He has 3 sons, so we look into the sons, because when you, in the traditional sort of sense, when you go to war, you send your sons. You send your sons. Obviously, you go with them, but certain sort of conflicts, you send your sons. It's a way of preparing them to take on the kingship, basically. So we explore the sons. We look at their journey and their friendship with locals, and understanding what his eventual decisions, how he impacted on his kids, how he impacted on the surrounding people, and the journey they took afterwards. I don't want to spoil the story, but basically, it's not a simple hero story that's centered around one person. It does break off and become more of a. You end up following different people, effectively.
So you mentioned the 2 wives. So there's 2 wives and 2 daughters as well, right? So how did you ensure that you were writing authentic female characters? I mean, like as a male, how do you write from the perspective of a black woman, a black queen, 2 black queens, and princesses? How do you make sure you get that right? 'Cause you don't want to get killed out here on social media for come on, 1 king, 2 wives. What's going on here? How did you make sure that you were keeping this authentic and getting a real female's point of view? Because I got to stand on the side of the sisters here. So I have to apologise here. I think it's because I used the word male, but for some reason I start to refer to women from this point on as females. It's a personal pet hate of mine, and it just seems to happen when guys get together to have conversations about women when there are no women around. And when I listen back to the audio, I've got to be honest and say I was mortified. I didn't want to cut it out, because I think sometimes when you make mistakes, you should leave it out there as a personal record of what you did wrong. And if it doesn't annoy you, then fine. But it annoys me, and I just want to apologise to anybody else it annoys, because it's a personal pet hate of my own. So, right, that's me. I'm out until the end of this interview. Please forgive me. All I can say is that I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course. Obviously, as you're aware, the book is co-authored. So it was co-authored by an African female as well. So that element of it was massively, she had a massive influence in it.
I bet she did.
Yeah, she did. Which does, I don't think, she had a massive influence in it, but at the same time, the original sort of core of the story wasn't sort of disparaging to a black woman. Of course,
I wouldn't expect.
And there were black female heroes in the story as well, as they are in real life. And ancient times, there were black warriors, female warriors, and there is actually a black queen in the book who has her own kingdom. So it is, the female element of it is raw and it is true, because I'm not trying to be liked by everyone. Because there will be elements of it that someone might find, oh, actually, in this current climate, you might think, oh, actually, that is not very sort of PC.
Talk to me about that.
At the same time, yeah.
Talk to me about non-PC. What's not PC?
But at the same time, it is true to the sort of the African heritage at that time, because obviously the African heritage at the time was, and to a certain extent still is, a man obviously is in charge. the birthright belongs to the man. If you have a son, he goes first before the woman. So if you had like 3 girls first, and you had the last born son, he would be king ahead of the girls, which he still is till today. You also have, in certain cultures, not all cultures, but in certain cultures in Africa, you have this idea that women are not meant to go to war, are not meant to ride horses or camels, and so on and so forth. Whereas in other areas in Africa, you have it where women go to war and they fight. And so there are elements, they're both elements basically. The elements that you might find, actually, this is not right, and the elements where you agree with, but it is telling the story the way it actually is. Like, you know, it's not trying to pander to a certain narrative. So it's basically telling.
How many fights were there between you and your co-author about the polygamous relationship? How did that work out? Give it to me.
No, actually, she agreed with it completely.
Okay.
Because she understood. I mean, obviously, she understood the time and period it was written, and she understands that, you know, an African king having 2 wives is actually it's quite small. To be honest, a lot of
could have had more.
A lot of them do have quite a few, and still do to today.
Yep.
So, you know, it's quite common for people to have more than 1 wife, because you must remember, and the reason why this book is written is to show the lives of the people at that period in time, not in today's climate. And I need to stay true to that. Obviously, I did not trying to be overly sort of rude to a female, for instance, but just tell the story as it is, which shows male heroes, female heroes, young heroes, and old heroes, you know, in that fashion, and also shows people losing as well and dying in both sort of genocide. Is balanced in that sense.
Yep.
So you have war, people die. So yeah.
So I'm going to put you on the spot now. 2020, we're here now. Would you have 2 wives? 2020, 2 twos. Would you have 2 wives in 2020?
Well, me personally?
Yeah, today. King.
No, I wouldn't.
No.
As a Christian, no, I would. 1 wife is enough for me.
1 wife is enough. Okay. I fully agree. I can only handle 1. Hats off to those who can handle more than 1. I'm good with my solo right now. Okay. I had to ask. Okay, so I'm staying on that topic. So, out of you and your co-author, who wrote the sex scenes? Because there is sex in this book. It's an adult book, and I'm going to stress this now. It's an adult book, just as you would find it's nearer to Game of Thrones than you would find to Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is PG compared to the XXX rated Game of Thrones. And, you know, I did read the book, and I use a screen reader, and I had it reading out loud, and my son walked in on the middle of a very graphic sex scene, like hearing it out in audio. He didn't walk in on it himself. But so who wrote those, and why are they in there?
So why are they in there?
Yeah, tell me. It's so you could have left them out. They're not in The Hobbit. They're in all books. You could have decided to make this for younger readers, but you've gone the other route. So they're in there for a reason. Yeah.
So if I wrote it, and she wrote, obviously edited it. So it's both in certain elements, I would say. But why are they in there? I would say as a writer, I wanted to develop on the relationships that happen between people. And obviously that includes both sort of them as characters interacting with themselves, facing challenges together, and at the same time is the intimacy between them and how that intimacy is explored. And I felt like if I took that out, I don't think the overarching story would change, but as a reader, I'll feel like it doesn't show how close those characters are. And there are certain sex scenes that are not, how do I put it? They're in there to tell a particular story, which affects it because someone is doing something which you wouldn't say is right. Basically, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no rape scenes or anything like that, but it's just it's there to tell a certain story about that character. And there is a sex scene that is meant to show a character going through a phase in her life. I don't think you've reached there yet.
No, I haven't reached there.
It's meant to go through a phase in her life, and the sex scene is not just. The sex scene is less about the actual sex, but more about her feeling whilst she was having that sex, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense.
It was so.
You know, I asked
if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense to me, and I asked the question specifically because in my own research of, you know, African history and Pan-African history, one of the things that I often struggle to find are love stories. There are very few love stories. We have the, you know, you mentioned earlier before about Egypt. We have Cleopatra and Mark Antony, but what? Who cares about that? Like, and you know, we have more modern tales, but going back into ancient history, or should I say pre-transatlantic slavery history, there are very few love stories to find, and just love stories in general. And I feel that very much in terms of Black culture, Pan-African culture, the love story is sex. Sex is there. Yeah. Sex is there. Sex is in the music. It's in the dance. Sex and sexuality is there, but often love is missing.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that in the book you have both. There is love and there is sex. You know, there is marriage, the relationship. They're fully fledged, three-dimensional, 360-degree relationships, and we get to see the good, the bad, the ugly, and the reality.
Exactly.
And so,
which I think is the reason why I left it, because when the whole process of writing, well, when I was writing it, the one thing that obviously crossed my mind was, like you said, it's kind of like a thing where we, especially Africans in the continent, they're not used to romantic stories and reading sex in their books. Is not common. And I was thinking, should I actually leave it in there? Because some people are going to be like, I'm not sure. And Karen, my co-author, she was like, we definitely need to leave that in there, because it is a part of the story. Like you said, it's a three-dimensional story. It's meant to show the story as it is, like the good, the bad, the ugly parts of it, and the sex is in that, and it tells the whole thing without trying to clean it up or trying to make it shit to a certain audience, and that's the reason why I think it is in there. And since it's been out for about 2 months now, just over 2 months. I have had feedback, both positive and people who were like, oh, actually, I didn't expect to read the sex scenes because they're not used to reading African stories with that element in it. And there are people who are like, I read it and that's the part I actually like the most in the book. So, you're always going to have that. You're going to have people who would like it and people who wouldn't like elements of the story. But the most important part of it is, as a writer and someone who's telling the stories, to tell the story as it appears to you. So that way, at the end of it, I don't feel like I've cheated myself, and I don't feel like I've cheated the story itself by cutting out bits of it. Yeah, and I think I'll probably go in the same route for the second and third book. Yeah. Fantastic.
So you've used that phrase a few times, tell the story, right? So what do you want the readers of this first book to come away with? How would you like them to feel by the time they reach at the end of the story? Once you've told the story, what do you want them to come away with? How do you?
I think, and obviously right now quite a few people read it and got back to me about how they felt. I had quite a few African Americans read it and they felt like positively overwhelmed. There's a lady who recorded a video and was like, Wow. Because the reason why she felt that way was both the style of writing and the objective of the writing is to place you in the world. So, like, I'm trying to get the reader to picture what life was like in the 13th century, because the book is to show the lives of our ancestors at that period in time. There's obviously a story that continues right the way through, but in that story, you're placed in the world. It's built around you. You're able to picture what the sky looks like, how tall the trees are, the sort of animals, what the houses are built of, kind of the costumes the characters are wearing. You picture the world and you feel like you're in the story. And at the end of the book, what I want the readers to come out with is understanding the most important thing is that as Africans, we had African civilization, and we had trade between kingdoms, understanding we had an hierarchical system that was fully functional with a king at the top and his subjects below him, and so on and so forth. But most importantly, what the story would give them is an ability to picture that world, to be able to picture that civilization, to feel like you were actually in there. And I think that's the feeling they'll get at the end.
Okay.
Of this first book.
Why is it important for you that people come away with that ability to picture the world and be able to see it?
Because I think it's very important that we as Africans tell our own stories, because we're the only ones who are able to do it real justice. And the more we're able to tell our stories, and the more we're able to write about these sort of pre-slavery, pre-colonial Africa, is by the time you read one book, you have a picture of what the world was like. You read another book, you have another picture. It kind of builds that idea in your head about what African history is, without having to have it memorized in your head. It's just the same way you and I understand what European history is. We understand what the Romans went through. We understand the Anglo-Saxon history, the Viking history, because there's been so much literature written about it. So the more we're writing these stories, both fictional and non-fictional, in wherever form it comes in, it paints that picture in people's minds. And the more stories are written, the more that picture gets cemented in our consciousness.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to ask you some lighter questions now. Okay, quick fire. So, firstly, have you seen Gods of Egypt?
I looked at that film. I didn't like it, so I didn't watch the whole thing. Yeah.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Which character in the book is most like you?
It's most likely. That's just a good question. I think I don't want to say this.
Say it.
People when you read it, you probably tell.
Say it.
But it's Eweka. Eweka is an interesting character, and if you read it, you know who Eweka is. But Eweka is like, he's not a prince, or he's not.
Say no more. Say no more. They've got to read the book. Eweka.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Has your mum and dad read the book?
Yeah, my dad has read it quite a few times, actually. He keeps asking me when I'm going to write the second one.
Okay. What did mum and dad say about the sex scenes?
My dad said he liked the book. He said he liked it. That he thinks that it was right that I left that in there, because it is part of the story.
Fantastic.
He's read it a few times. So.
Daddy's read it a few times, so Daddy, he's proud of you. Good job. And mum?
She is. She's always messaging people about the book.
Fantastic. Favorite food?
Favorite food would be pounded yam and a good sauce.
Oh, good answer. Okay, gonna mix it up a bit now. So, there's a football match. You brought up here. It's England versus Nigeria. Which side are you cheering on?
That's Nigeria.
Okay.
The reason why
no
is
reason
because but we need to say it, right? like we have, like, Nigeria has, like, even most African countries have struggled in the World Cup and so on. So I think we do need to improve, but Yeah, definitely. Because like England has won the World Cup.
What? I'm telling you, the first African country to win it, we ain't handing it back. Okay, so England versus Jamaica. Which side you cheering on?
England versus Jamaica is have to be Jamaica.
Good answer. We like you here. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this is a harder one for you. Jamaica versus Ghana.
Oh, that's a hard one. That is a hard one. I don't know if I'd like Ghana win. I'll go Jamaica actually.
Yeah.
I'll go Jamaica. We get too much beef about with Ghana and jollof rice. It's telling us how their jollof rice is better. So.
Okay. All right. So, where can people buy the book, and how can they find you if they want to know more?
So they can go on our website, which is GHAGerianpublishing.com. So it's GHAGERIAN publishing.com. So PUBLISHING.com. One word.
Fantastic.
Nigerian Publishing. Or you can just go on Amazon and search for the title, A Cry to War, or search for my name, Odiase, Odise, and it should come up. And yeah, wherever you are in the world, you should be able to get a book.
Fantastic. And when is the next one coming out?
That's a good question. I've started working on it. Just started. It should be out towards, I would say, early part of next year, 2021.
Okay, so we're not on a Game of Thrones 17 years later.
No. It's either right at the end of this, like Christmas this year, or early part of next year. But yeah, around that sort of period.
Fantastic. All right,
yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. I really hope you enjoyed the episode, and thank you for continuing to support the show. If you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review on whatever app you're using to hear my voice. I would love it if you joined me on Patreon or Podfan, where you can listen to dozens of bonus episodes and the full uncut version of this interview. You can join for as little as £1. There are no long-term commitments, and each contribution helps to keep the show ad-free. You can find links in the description. Oh, and one last thing. Thank you to a girl from Cleveland, Ohio, a lovely Blundernitz, and Tone Deaf Musical for leaving me some really lovely comments on social media. You've been listening to the Black History Buff podcast, a production from BHB Media.